Hey, what's going on, guys? We're back to part 4, and today I'm going to explain floats. And what floats are, it's another type of number variable, but instead of an integer where it can't have a decimal, 0, 1, 2, whatever, a float is the exact opposite. It's a value that always has a decimal, and it's a huge decimal. It's made for extremely accurate numbers. And so we can go ahead and make our first float the same way we made our first integer. Let's make it public, and then float. We'll call it my first float. And let's default this value to how about 1.2. It doesn't really matter. Okay. Oh, and I forgot. Whenever you make a float value, you can't just have a decimal, or else it'll. There are a bunch of different. I remember I was saying that there's a bunch of different number variables that you can use. There's integers, there's doubles, there's shorts, there's longs, and then there's floats. And basically, all you need to know is that C# thinks that if you put a decimal, it could be a short or a double. Basically, by putting f at the end, that just means that counted as a float. Okay. And obviously, we can use the same operators for integer as we did with float. So for instance, we could do my first integer equals my first float plus 1. You know, that's a perfectly valid statement. You can take a float value, add 1 to it, and assign that to an integer. However, you have to keep in mind that this is a float value which has decimals, and this is the integer value, which doesn't have decimals. So in order to do that, we're going to need to convert this to an integer, which I don't really want to go into converting, casting yet. So we can use it the other way around. My first float equals my first integer plus 1. That's fine, because you can convert an integer to a float. You just can't go from a float to an integer. Natively, you can, but I don't want to explain how right now. Okay. Now, typically, you'll notice I had a multiply and divide here, but usually I like to use those for floats for a certain reason, and that's because when you try and multiply, or divide, rather, when you try and divide two integers, if they're not divisible, for instance, if you have like a remainder, or it's supposed to be a decimal, it'll die. It won't work, because you need decimals, and if it can't use decimals, then the division will not work, and that's why usually you need to use floats or cast your integer to a float when using division. For instance, let's do this. Let's comment all this stuff out, and in here we're gonna go. Let's log, make new parentheses inside here, and put in my first integer divided by my first float, and then outside put .toString. Okay, so what this will do is on startup it'll take my first integer, which is 1, divide it by my first float, which is 1.2, and output that value to the log. Okay, and obviously we could do the same for multiply too. You know, that's multiply, just an asterisk. Come in here, hit that play button, and 1.2. 1 times 1.2 is 1.2. Now, another thing that reminds me, because we marked those properties as public, they show up in here in our inspector. So if I change this value to something like 8, hit play, now our value is 9.2. So it'll, even though we defaulted it to 1, if we change it in here, it'll use this value instead, which is really useful. Okay? And now the next thing I want to do is a third type of variable. This one is not a number, it's called a Boolean. And basically a Boolean is something that means yes or no. Or true or false, rather. That's a better way of explaining it. True or false. So let's go ahead and make another property. Let's do public bool, just short for Boolean, and we'll call it my first bool. And we'll set it default to false. Okay. Um, mm, Other than printing it, let me explain some of the operators we can have here. Let me just delete all this junk here. So for booleans, there are several things we can use. There's the equals equals, greater than, less than or equal to, greater than or equal to, and does not equal, and not. Okay, so let me explain these. Booleans are returned whenever you compare two variables. For instance, we can do my first bool is equal to my first integer equals 1. So let me explain this here. Pretend you can't see this part. But look at just my first integer equals 1. What this is doing is taking my first integer, which remember we have default set as 1, and checking to see if it equals the value 1. And if it does, this means true. Then we're taking this true value and setting it to my first bool. The same way we can use not equal to. The exclamation point means not in C#. So now we're saying if my first integer does not equal 1, then set this to true and put it in my first bool. If it does equal 1, then this would be false. Obviously the same thing can go for greater than or equal to, less than, and less than or equal to. Okay, so that's pretty simple. You'll notice at the end here I put this not. That's for when you have a return value from a method, and I don't really want to go into that right now. We'll go into that later, but just keep in mind that this exclamation mark means not. Okay? So, we'll do this. We'll do debug.log my first bool .toString. And we'll make this greater than 5. Hit save. Go back to Unity here. Alright. So you'll notice it's setting to true every frame. And that is because my first integer is greater than 5 is an 8. But the instant I change it to something lower than 5, like 1, it is now false. You'll see a bunch of false messages here. And if, by the way, if you didn't know, there's a clear button up here if your debug is getting too messy. And then I can, go ahead and change it back to 6 once again. It goes to true. And that's how you store true and false values. Alrighty? So now that I've got some of the really basic stuff down, we're going to go ahead and start to move more into to Unity and see what kind of stuff we can accomplish with this. So I'm going to go ahead and start to ask you guys what you want to see. So I've kind of like a generic plan of where I want to go with the series. Obviously, the name of the game was FPS TD, but I'm up. I can kind of do whatever I want with it. So, so yeah, I'm open to suggestions. If not, I guess the generic plan would be to we'll get motion up and running. However, that's kind of built in, so it'll be a really fast tutorial, and then we can add something on top of that. So we can add in. Well, I'll figure it out. I'll see you guys next time.